Good evening, everybody. Hell's Unicorn back here once again after a long absence due to an unforeseen illness which robbed me of my powers of speech for the better part of 3 weeks. So this first little return to form here is going to cover the just now concluded ABC Republican primary debate, and I'm also going to get into the recent gaffe that Newt Gingrich had with regards to Palestine. To start off with the debate, I just want to make a quick comment. Whenever you watch a debate on ABC, more so even than with the other networks, watch the debate and skip the after-debate commentary, because I don't think I was watching the same debate that Stephanopoulos and Diane Sawyer were watching, and all the other analysts for that matter. The entire time that they were talking, it was Newt Gingrich this, Newt Gingrich that, Newt. And in particular, they referenced the part where Newt supposedly smacked down Mitt Romney and said, and I quote to Mitt Romney, "The reason why you were not a professional politician is because you lost to Ted Kennedy." Now, the thing that I found interesting about this was that almost everybody making any noise in the audience at that was booing. And they weren't booing at Romney. I'll tell you that right now. They were booing Newt because he came off as a pompous jackass and a jerk. Nobody who saw that moment can say with any level of uncertainty that Gingrich was not doing himself any favors by conducting himself that way. And the fact that all of the pundits there were somehow saying that Mitt had an off night because of this particular moment. Whatever they're smoking, I want some. But anyway, on to the debate itself. Platitudes prevailed. But ironically enough, there was a lot of Ron Paul love going on amongst all the candidates, and nobody wanted to go after Paul on foreign policy. They're afraid of him. The only people that are not afraid of Paul are idiots like Mark Levin, people that live in an echo chamber and don't actually have to face their opposition. Personally, I think next time, instead of throwing snowballs at Sean Hannity, track down the little bald-headed Groucho Marx grandmother with a hysterectomy, in the words of Michael Savage, and instead of just throwing regular snowballs, soak them in water until they turn to ice and toss them at them. And aim for the shiny spot just on top of his forehead. It'll do the least damage. But anyway, Newt Gingrich was pummeled throughout the entire first hour of this thing. The first hour segment, it was probably about 40 to 45 minutes because we had some commercials in there. And his responses were out-and-out lies. Like the response he gave to Ron Paul, where Paul said, you took taxpayer money, which is what government money is when you get paid by it. Freddie Mac is a government-subsidized government agency. When you're making money by working for it, that's not private sector activity. You might be a private company getting that money, but that money was not procured through the actual marketplace. Not if you're separating the marketplace from the government. Now, if you want to look at it in terms of the government being part of the marketplace, well, okay, then we're talking in terms of fascism, and that's definitely Newt Gingrich's department. Rick Perry came off as a dunderhead, as usual, but he came off as a more religious dunderhead, and I know I promised one of my viewers that I'd do a video explaining why I don't like Rick Perry, and also my thoughts, he recently asked me about this, my thoughts regarding Rick Perry's recent Brokeback Mountain ad. I'll get into that in a different video as well. But there's nothing to write home about. All of these people tried to talk about bits and pieces of what Ron Paul had been talking about, but they didn't want to talk about the whole package. Ron Paul's the only one talking about ending the foreign wars. Huntsman has talked about easing off a bit on the foreign wars, but he was not in Congress tonight. I don't know if he was excluded because his poll numbers suck in Iowa or because he's literally living in New Hampshire now, which is probably more likely the case. But anyway, he wasn't really missed. He's not really that inspiring of a speaker to begin with. I mean, he's not really that animated. My biggest problem with John Huntsman is that just like Barack Obama when he talks, he sounds like what the media refers to as being presidential, and I hate people that talk in presidential ways because what they're doing is they're talking in a lofty voice and not actually saying a thing at all. Literally, it's just an endless foray of bromides, things that can be discerned but yet can't really be applied to anything material, so to speak. That's what you get. And I might have to start a series at some point. I'm not sure when I'm going to get to this, where I'm just going to do these little mini blogs and I'm just going to rip apart some of these bromides that I hear most often in the media because they give me a headache, and I feel the best medicine for that is to just cut loose and explain the fact that when the media says we need somebody who gets things done or something must be done, that's so open-ended that could literally mean anything. And that's a lot of what I got from the answers specifically regarding the economy. The fact that the moderators kept asking over and over again at the beginning to get specific numbers for how many jobs would be created, there's no way to accurately predict that. Can anybody with one iota of common sense state out in plain English exactly how many jobs are created by whichever policy the government takes in a nation with 300 million people? Can a person in a major metropolitan area with maybe 1% of that amount of people living in it make such a lofty claim? No. You can't predict what people are going to do because you cannot fully ascertain the nature of any individual person apart from yourself. You can't project yourself astrally and know what choices are people are going to make, even if you put them in a laboratory and you try to mess with their environment, so to speak. There's going to be some unknowns whenever you're in a situation like that. There's going to be some spontaneous outcomes, or they'll appear spontaneous to you because you're not that person. And that's ultimately the case where Ron Paul gets it right, particularly on the healthcare thing. This was probably the best moment of the whole debate, and I guarantee you nobody's going to talk about it. When Ron Paul was asked about what programs the government should pursue to get people to eat healthier, he stated, and I quote, "If the government has to protect us from ourselves, we're in a lot of trouble." And like I was saying earlier with the whole notion that we cannot assume a nature that is capable of fully ascertaining another person's nature, if we're pursuing that mode of governance, we are taking on the assumption that we can, even though we can't. And the obvious end result is tyranny. But I think that's what ABC wants in a president, because they kept on giving so much love to Newt Gingrich, the guy who apparently seems to think that the Palestinians are a made-up people. I am going to deal with this in a biblical fashion, because that's the only way you can deal with this issue, because anybody who knows anything about what's going on in the Middle East is either some stripe of Christian or has in some way, shape, or form studied the religion. If you read the Old Testament, depending on what viewpoint you take, any group of people can be viewed as being made up. They take onto themselves certain names, they flock together, they create societies, they create entire cities and empires, and those empires take onto themselves names. Israel, in a sense, is an invented people. According to my viewpoint, it's a people that were invented specifically by God through covenant. The Palestinian people, as they are defined today, exist in part because of I would say, more of a oath-bound form of covenant, which is they've oathed to each other, and they've attempted to make an oath, a vow to God, which is the second part of a covenant. And in their own way, even though the Muslims have a very radically different view of what God is, they are ultimately trying to make an appeal to what Christianity argues is the one sovereign universal Godhead, so to speak. All pagans are attempting to do this and not getting it right according to Christianity, so that's another thing to keep in mind. That's the viewpoint that the Bible takes of all religions that are supposedly false. It is an erroneous attempt to try to get into a proper relationship with God by people that don't know how to do it and refuse to listen to the instruction of how to do it. That's the viewpoint that the Bible takes. And the Bible also takes the viewpoint that most of Israel itself had this problem, and this is the reason why Israel was constantly getting into trouble. Now, societies have gone out of existence, they've been broken up and dispersed, and they have reformed over time. The only fair-minded approach to take to something like this is to accept the fact that people and peoples, both people in the individual sense and people in the group sense, since people do ultimately flock into groups at some level, have the right to self-determine, and they have the right to property. And property includes land. Now, the property that the Palestinians are claiming ownership of is property that they had. They probably did not have it at the time when Israel was thriving as it was in the Old Testament. But they were there and they were dispossessed. Societies in general form and reform through, in some cases, dispossessing others. It's a very unfortunate fact of life, but it is something that comes about. People go to war with each other, they conquer each other. That's the whole thing. The whole idea behind Jesus Christ's Sermon on the Mount, and this is the one part of the gospel that you will see every dispensationalist run from like crazy the minute they hear it. The whole idea behind the Sermon on the Mount was the notion that we can do better than conquering each other and taking over each other's property and bending it to our own will. That we can find more practical solutions. Love thine enemies. If you love your enemy in the same respect that you love your friend, and your enemy in turn learns to love and respect you, the whole entire purpose of war is negated. Or to use an analogy from Star Trek The Next Generation, there was an episode specifically considering a Vulcan telepathic device that was used basically as a weapon. And there were two deity depictions on this particular weapon. One was the god of war, and one was the god of death, cause and consequence. Standing in between them was the god of peace. The notion of this analogy is the idea that peace stands between war and death, separates them, makes them unable to meet with each other halfway. And the defense against this device was to purge oneself of all thoughts of hatred and violence towards your enemy who was wielding the device. The device became useless in this regard. Mind you, the biblical definition of meekness, and this is actually also a definition that is largely maintained in most dictionaries, is not the same as weakness. Meekness is having power, but restraining oneself from using it. And particularly in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, using it carelessly. America has, for the better part of 100 years, resorted to using its power carelessly. And eventually we're going to reap the consequences of this. I stand in opposition to most of the evangelical crowd on this particular issue. I don't want to take sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a number of reasons. The Jews that populate Israel are closer to me theologically than the Muslims. However, the Oriental Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, and other various Christians that are still living in the West Bank are closer to me theologically than either the Muslims or the Jews. The Jews in Israel have written in the Babylonian Talmud, which they consider to be the supreme law. It is for the entire Orthodox community and just about everybody else who adheres to Israeli law. That is the law, the king of laws, the Babylonian Talmud. You go through that book. I'll provide a website that has quotes of this. You will come across such juicy little quotes as, Jesus is in hell, face down in a pit of excrement, and that Jesus, while he lived, was a sexual deviant who practiced black magic, and other things such as Mary, the virgin mother of Jesus, was a fornicating whore, and that Jesus was a bastard son. This is a little something that I will direct towards dispensationalist Judaizing heretics like No Implant for Me and P.P. Simmons, both of whom I will provide links to their channels for so the rest of you can give them some grief over this. Do you believe any of the stuff that I just read from the Babylonian Talmud? It's actual quotation. It's English. It was originally written in Hebrew, but those are the exact English translations. Do you as Christians believe that? Do you believe that Jesus was not the Son of God, but simply the bastard son of some Roman centurion or some other individual male of either Roman or Jewish extract who was nobody of the line of David? Do you believe that Jesus practiced black magic? Do you believe that he is currently in hell, immersed in a pit of shit? If you agree with this nonsense, take the cross off of your pages, off of your channels, and keep the Israeli flag, because that's more in line with what you're supporting. Can't have both of them. These two individual users who regularly make anti-Ron Paul videos, they are the embodiment of what happens when you ignore the gospel and you only read the prophetic books. You only read Zechariah, you only read Daniel, and you only read Revelation, and you don't care about anything else in the Bible. If you're a systematic theologian, if you care about getting all of it right with regards to the Bible, you will condemn idiots like this. Because the gross errors that they fall into, the stuff that is directly contradicted in Matthew, Mark, John, and Luke, and in the epistles that Paul made to the Corinthians, to the Galatians, to the Romans, and so on and so forth. These Judaizers are not Old Testament Christians. They are not New Testament Christians. There is no such thing as either one of these. You either have the whole thing or you have none of it. They're false prophets, and they're fools, and they're idiots, and they deserve every single negative comment that they're getting on their channels, yea, even from people that don't believe. And this is me talking as a Christian to other Christians of a like mind to my own here. I don't believe in replacement theology. I believe in systematic theology. And systematic theology tells me that in order for the prophecy laid out in Revelation to be fulfilled, at some point, the Jews that have gathered in Israel are going to have to accept Christ as the Messiah. At some point they're going to have to do that. They can't do that while they're still exalting the Babylonian Talmud. It's that simple. And they're still exalting it. The law of their country is based off of that book. And on a related subject, just to ask Newt Gingrich one more thing, since he's in the topic of calling things fictional, and in some cases being technically correct, but also being very misleading at the same time, is the population of 25,000 Persian Jews currently living in Iran who have condemned the threats made by Israel towards Iran. Are those people fictional also? Are they not really Jews? Are those 11 synagogues in Iran that are still operating? Is that Jewish representative in the Iranian parliament, is he fiction as well? Is everybody that's not a member of the neocon establishment fictional to you, Mr. Newt Gingrich? Is Ron Paul fictional? Is the rest of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party fictional to you? Because if you think that's what we are, I'll tell you right now, we will become fictional. We will either stay home, we will vote third party, or those of us that you have really alienated, should you become the nominee, might just play around with voting for Barack Obama just to see you lose. That's how much you alienate us when you say idiotic things like this. Just to close this out, because I know I am going long like I have a tendency to do of late, I'm just going to state that if you have one verse in the Bible, and this is directed towards my Christian subscribers, some of whom might be dabbling with dispensationalism, if you have one verse in the Bible that supports your position, look for a second one. If you have two, look for four. If you have four, look for eight. If you have one book that agrees with you, read the other books. Read the whole thing. Parse it. Peruse it. Study it. Study the historians, anthropologists, study the systematic theologians of the past. Read the apologists. Read everything that you can and check everything that you can get your hands on against the Scripture and come to a logical determination based on what it says. I don't want to hear any garbage about you prophesizing. Prophecy is reserved to the apostolic church, and that ended with the death of the last apostle. We have a governing body of the church, and we have a civil secular government. That is what we have been left with until Christ's return. When you take onto yourself the role of miracle worker, of tongue speaker, of church magician, which is really what all of that is at this point, you are a liar. And I want nothing to do with you. I was subscribed to P.P. Simmons for a little while because he actually made some sense on some certain points. It was a short-lived subscription. I'd only seen a couple of his videos, which I found interesting, but I've unsubscribed from him. I've never been subscribed to No Implant for Me, for obvious reasons. The guy is an ignoramus. He knows not what he speaks of. I could throw dozens of biblical quotes at him. He will just rave on and on about his own little peculiar fancy for whatever quote of Revelation fits his own personal agenda. He's a puppet. He's being manipulated on marionette strings by some preacher who's probably getting money either from Israel or from some secret Jesuit organization that's trying to undermine whatever establishment of religion is in his particular locale, or something else is going on behind the scenes. Somebody's getting paid money to say this garbage. But anyway, I digress. Until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.